everybody. It's really great to be here, and we have the rockinest panel of women to take on the world. And what we're hoping to do here is have a lively conversation about what they see as the real challenges in cities, how their role as sustainability directors has really moved the needle, what some of the challenges might be that they see in making change happen. And we're also going to be calling on you all. So what we're planning on doing is asking for questions partway through the session. I believe, I can't entirely see them, but I think they're mics on stands. And if you could come up to the mics when we open it up for questions, it would be great. These three women represent some really innovative cities. We have Melanie Nutter, who recently was the head of the Department of the Environment for the city of San Francisco, and now she is running her own firm consulting on sustainability in smart cities. We have Catherine Gajewski, who is the sustainability director for the city of Philadelphia. Very different from San Francisco, but also taking on some of the most challenging issues in making an older city as green as possible. And then we have Denise Quarles, who is the sustainability director for the city of Atlanta. Again, very different, growing, one of the fastest growing cities in the US, and yet really tackling the issues of sustainability in the everyday work of the way the city operates and its priorities and how it partners with the private sector. So I'm going to start out with a few questions, and then we will open it up for your thoughts. So Melanie, I wanted to ask you, sometimes people look at San Francisco as this sort of green nirvana and like home of the groovy tech industry and food world that is off the charts. And yet they don't really see, are any things that come out of San Francisco actually replicable to other places? And I wonder, can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I want to thank Gordon and Jesse for the invitation to come to Detroit. I'm a Midwesterner from Chicago, so it's fun to come back to the Midwest. And really fun to be up here with colleagues and friends who I've gotten a chance to work with over the past few years in my role as director at Department of the Environment. So in response to the question, it is true that San Francisco, we received the award as greenest city in North America back in 2010. And so that was after a number of decades of implementing some cutting edge environmental policies, and some of them that were first in the nation. Mm-hmm. And so San Francisco for a number of years has had a culture of pushing the envelope, taking risks, and not being afraid to try something new. And that's really because there is the culture there, as well as citizens who expect us to be pushing the envelope on green. But it's true that sometimes people will look at some of the initiatives and say, well, that's only in San Francisco. What does that mean to my city? And there are a lot of great examples, just one that I want to share, where it shows that with cities really acting as living laboratories for new innovative initiatives, there is an opportunity to create something that seems crazy, but then can be replicated elsewhere. So I'll just use the one example of the plastic bag ban. Back in 2007, San Francisco was the first city in the nation to ban plastic bags at grocery stores. And people thought, that's crazy, what are they doing? Just a blanket ban. And our city council then back in 2012 expanded that to all retail stores. So now all retail stores in San Francisco have no plastic bag, and you do need to pay 10 cents to get a compostable or paper bag. And fast forward to this week, where our current governor, Governor Brown, just signed a law making California the first state in the US to ban plastic bags throughout the entire state. So it's just an example where something that seemed crazy back in 2007 grew to 100 cities throughout California and now is replicated at the state level. So it really can work and be replicated.
Well, and took off in other cities. So I think a point off of that is that we as sustainability directors in cities have found each other. So many of us are the first people in our job. We came in with huge expectations, these big plans, these big ideas, and we were like one person with duct tape and bubble gum trying to figure out how to do this, right? And so what happened like 5 or 6 years ago is that we all started to try to find each other in other cities, saying we're not in competition, we actually don't have the time, energy, or money to be recreating the wheel, so how can we work together purposefully to kind of scale initiatives, test in some cities, deploy in others. So we formed a peer-to-peer network called the Urban Sustainability Directors Network 6 years ago, maybe, and it's kind of a virtual and a physical convening for those of us working in cities across North America to find each other, share information, and strategically kind of test the best ideas, tweak them as needed, and then spread them out. So plastic bags, bike share, green infrastructure, city energy project, and work around building disclosure and benchmarking. All of these now are kind of strategically happening between cities who are working together to figure out who's ready to be a part of the first wave, who's right behind, kind of curious but needing to learn more, but potentially part of that second wave, and how do we kind of get some work done to bring about a third wave. So that's, I think, a big change that's helped information from one leading city get to the next set of cities behind.
Yeah, so let's stick on this whole theme of replicability and how do you get a city to really take on new challenges? And so, Denise, you know, Atlanta has made some really phenomenal strides in the green energy efficiency of buildings, 200 plus buildings participating in your challenge. What do you think has really been the success or the key to success? Because I think maybe some of us would have thought, no way would that ever happen in Atlanta.
Sure. Well, great things are happening in Atlanta, so no one should say no way would anything as it relates to green and sustainability happen in Atlanta. But let me first, I think, start out by giving some context. Mayor Reed is an awesome mayor, and when he originally came into office back in 2010, very early in his administration, he said and made that commitment to making Atlanta a top-tier recognized city for sustainability. Yeah. And so through that, you've seen several commitments that actually have become realized. So when it came to an initiative, Shelley, that you referred to as the Better Buildings Challenge, it was very easy for the community to rally around. And so it's an awesome project. I think part of the reason that Atlanta's been so successful, and when you refer to the 200 or so buildings, Atlanta initially started out with saying we want to see if we could get 2 million square feet committed to this challenge in our downtown area. It has since spread out citywide. We have 70 million square feet committed to the challenge and over 200 buildings. And it's a very diverse portfolio. So it's academic institutions, it is the faith-based institutions, including city government. So again, it's just a part of everybody realizing that it's a great opportunity to not only reduce our operational costs and saving money, but it's creating jobs, and it's the right thing to do for the environment.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, and was it the leadership of the mayor that really kind of attracted all those stakeholders to come to the table, or?
It was largely the leadership of the mayor, but it's the ownership of the individual stakeholders and operators. Mm-hmm. And it was a program that's developed organically, and everybody felt like they played a role in making it happening. Mm-hmm. And so Catherine and I are on a couple of projects that we've worked on together that it's not as if we walked in and said, here's exactly what it is that you need to do. We had stakeholders at the table who we were able to talk to say, the end goal is we'd like to see us reduce our energy and water use 20% by 2020, but let's collectively talk about how we're going to get there. Yeah. So we were able to leverage and make that happen.
Yeah, yeah. So Catherine, I want to ask you a question that's about Mayor Nutter's successes and your successes around attracting wow, over $40 million in grants for projects that make the city greener. I think I even heard about some other stuff around resilience grants the other day. Wow, how have you been so successful in doing that? And how has it been working inside the machine of local government to deliver on the promises of those grants?
Yeah, so I think we've been thinking a lot about this in Philadelphia. We're coming up on the last year of Mayor Nutter's second term, so he'll be leaving office at the end of 2015. So we've been doing a lot of kind of reflecting what worked, what didn't work, how do we set a next administration up to potentially take this on and sustain sustainability. I think following up on Denise's point, you know, when you think about the conditions for success around sustainability, strong leadership from the mayor is essential, but it's this tricky balance because you really need that essential leadership, but it also can't just be one person's plan and one person's initiative. It's really easy in government to pick off those special initiatives and transitions between administrations because mayors always run against the agenda of the mayor before them. So we've been trying to figure out, hopefully that's not a secret, right? I didn't let out city secret. So I think in Philly, I think first of all, Philly kind of came out of nowhere into this urban sustainability field. Like, Philly, what? You guys are cheesesteaks, Rocky, what? Green infrastructure? That's so weird. So we kind of came out of nowhere, and so I think there's a little bit of, at some point, you know, you need to make sure that work is happening in cities beyond Seattle and San Francisco, and so I think that we kind of came out at the right moment in terms of the growth of this field of practice, but also as maybe like the rogue player on the side. But I think what we've been trying to figure out how to do is how to make this not just about me kind of in my office doing this work or the mayor being the leader kind of wrangling people around this, but really infuse it across not only government, but across the city in general. And when Mayor Nutter came into office, he kind of took on sustainability as part of his agenda because there was a big citizen movement asking the candidates in that election to do so. So he kind of came in feeling like he had the support of the city, and then he went and structured his administration with this as a core agenda item. So he brought on deputy mayors who are like-minded. He talked to commissioners about why this was important to him. And so what we've been able to do in Philly is to make sure that sustainability isn't just this thing happening over there, but that it's really infused throughout our government and that we have that network of external partners who are backing us up and pushing us and calling for it. And our city council is a part of that too, that we've really tried to make them champions. So, you know, $40 million, that's just our teeny tiny office.
Right.
By kind of having a plan, we've been able to position for federal funds, you know, for some private funding, and having that plan, I think, has been the linchpin, the plan and the leadership. Mm-hmm. From there, you can do, you know, pretty much anything.
And I would just actually chime in on that. I do think that institutionalizing sustainability, I think really ultimately is the end goal, right? We all want to see a day where sustainability is embedded in the way that cities operate. It's not sort of something that is apart and separate. It almost might be great if in 20, 30, 50 years, however long it takes, sustainability offices don't exist because it's a key part of everything that every city department does. But until then, we need sustainability directors and people to focus to help with the leadership element. In San Francisco, we've done a very similar thing where at departments, there are now sustainability managers or sustainability officers within many city departments to help with that institutionalizing sustainability.
I think just one kind of follow-up wrap-up question on that point, like I feel that same way that we're starting to get there where I'm now hearing from people from different parts of city government, you know, the airport, the streets department, who are now, as they're making decisions, starting to think about some of the values and goals connected to sustainability as part of that decision-making process in a way that they didn't 5 years ago necessarily. Yeah. I think, though, that the next big challenge and the next big step for us is trying to figure out how to get to the big scale here, right? Like you can, if it's always one-offs on the perimeter, you're never going to be able to get to the big impacts that we know we need to have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, prepare for climate change. So I think the next deep dive is really trying to figure out how do you change some of these entrenched core systems within these huge bureaucracies at our city governments and really start to open those up to be more ripe to scale some of these ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Denise, maybe I'll ask you, You've been in your position since 2011. And have you seen a kind of new or different receptivity to your initiatives within government?
I have. Now, I came to city government from the private sector.
Right.
And in coming into the role, as Catherine was just talking about having a plan, one of the things that I think Atlanta has been very good about is first saying, let's talk about who our stakeholders are, right? So our stakeholders fit into 5 buckets. Everybody who lives, works, and plays in the city of Atlanta, Detroit, Philadelphia, San Francisco, whatever city that you come from, fall into really 5 buckets. It's business, it's academia, it's nonprofit, it's our residents, and academia, right? Everybody falls into those 5 buckets. And then we said, let's talk about impact. So as sustainability professionals, sometimes we can talk about NOx and SOx and these big terms that we can talk about sometimes, instead of talking about actual, what's the impact on air and water and waste and energy and land use, transportation. And so once we had some synergy around that, with those stakeholders at the table collectively talking about what was it going to take to make Atlanta this greener, more sustainable city, we got engagement. You know, we were able to say, you know, did you know that Atlanta has a growing season that's largely 365 days of a year? You know, and that's why Coca-Cola has been kind enough for their foundation to help the City of Atlanta fire departments put in organic learning gardens at our fire stations. And organizations like the Captain Planet Foundation has actually granted, along with some private partnerships, have granted the 5-county region around Atlanta, which consists of a little bit over 500 schools, they're putting in learning organic gardens. You know, so it's those type of initiatives that we've been able to collectively say, so to and Melanie's point about the one-offs, they're great, but when you can get collaborative things going on like the Atlanta Beltline and the things that's going on relative to urban ag and things that's going on within our electric vehicle infrastructure, you are seeing monumental change happening within the city. So the main answer to the question you asked is that what's been so significant is I'm not having to pull so much to try to get individuals to do things. People are pushing information to say, hey, let's think about this particular item, and if we can get the 95,000 single-family households, the 33,000 plus businesses, the 83 public school systems, and the government all doing this one thing, it makes an impact.
Wow, that's inspiring. That is so cool. So, Melanie and Catherine, do you have similar examples of where partnering with private sector or civic institutions really helped push an initiative forward in your city?
Yeah, I mean, one I think that we've been talking a little bit about is in the building sector. When I came to the Department of the Environment, there had been a number of years of history of working with the private sector, particularly on green building policies. And so San Francisco has pushed for many years LEED certification and now has a number of pretty forward-thinking requirements for LEED. But to take that one step further, one of the policies that we worked on was called, and is called, the Existing Commercial Building Ordinance. Ordinance that does require all commercial buildings 10,000 square feet and over to reveal their energy use and data and require them to give it to the city. It's basically a disclosure ordinance. And that was really something that would not have been supported without the partnership of the private sector, of the commercial building sector, of developers, of the San Francisco chapter of BOMA, saying we really need to do something to understand what our commercial building sector is doing in terms of energy use, and also have some transparency around what buildings are doing really well and what buildings still really do need to do some energy efficiency upgrades and put solar on their buildings. So that was one example, and again, it's part of the replication model, I think through USDN, where a number of cities, I think Philly, Washington, DC, Seattle, now have similar benchmarking ordinances that do help to drive energy efficiency in the commercial building sector.
Yeah, I think in Philly, something that's happening. So we have a program called Green City Clean Waters. We're an old city. We have a combined sewer system that brought us out of compliance with the Clean Water Act. And so we'd been in out-of-court conversations with the EPA for many years, maybe a decade, talking about what our plan was going to be to come into compliance with the Clean Water Act through a stormwater management program. So we had folks who were kind of the Office of Watersheds, a kind of renegade faction within our water department, who was starting to do the engineering math around what a gray infrastructure system build out would look like in Philadelphia. And the price tag was somewhere around $4 or $5 billion, and it was beyond what our ratepayers would be able to afford to do. And yet we had the federal mandate to do something to come into compliance. So what they started to do was to explore whether or not we could get intensive green infrastructure solutions to manage stormwater to bring us into compliance, and started to develop this plan called Green City Clean Waters, which we're the first city at scale to figure out a green infrastructure solution or plan towards this big problem that I think affects something like 1,100 municipalities across the United States. The EPA, I don't know if anyone here is from the EPA, so I can be corrected if I'm wrong later, but the EPA likes to be able to they don't necessarily like to set new precedents, and they like to be able to monitor and quantify things like how much water is moving through a system and how much water is being kept out of a river and that kind of thing. And so thinking about it in terms of green infrastructure and recreating natural systems that let water percolate into the ground system was very new and initially very scary. And we kept kind of plodding along, and finally just about 3 years ago, got approval both from the state and the federal government to move forward with our green infrastructure program as a means of coming into compliance with the Clean Water Act and managing our stormwater runoff. So we now are in our 3rd year of implementing what's going to be a 25-year, $2.5 billion intensive green infrastructure program. And what we said as a city was, listen, like, we could sink that money underground and put a lot of concrete there, or we could bring that investment to the ground level and at the same time do other things that we want to do along commercial corridors, in neighborhoods, in investments in open spaces that quite honestly we don't have the money to do otherwise. So it's interesting because it's a 25-year plan and it's now a federal mandate. So we're having to come together with local engineering firms to try to figure out how do we build this out in a way, how do we build out local expertise so that we can have Philadelphia firms responding to the work and getting a big part of this money back into the community? How do we work with the community groups to make sure that the interventions we're talking about for this section of North Philly fit the needs and are going to be taken care of by this community? So I think it's been a really good example for us. I mean, we're learning every day and encountering problems we could have never anticipated, and also seeing opportunities that we want to start chasing. But I think it's an example, getting back to the scale question, an example of how if you have a big plan and you start to have those pieces come together that give people confidence that something real is going to happen, people come together and they problem solve. As part of this, we had to change our stormwater billing system. So now some private sector water bills are going from a water use base to a stormwater impact fee. And it's totally renegotiating how we talk about water, and there's been some friction there. But ultimately then you're getting the private sector starting to lead in what's going to be the major public works project in Philly in our generation.
That's really great. I'm going to open it up for questions after this next question I'm going to make. So what strikes me about what all of you are saying is that your agenda around sustainability is really multidimensional. It's very interdisciplinary. I think that many people kind of come into this discussion thinking, oh, we're just talking about energy efficiency or water efficiency. And in fact, it's a much broader conversation about livability and economic vitality and those environmental benefits. How does the kind of lately, there's just such a growing interest in climate resilience. Is that a conversation that's coming up in your communities, or is it actually that sort of making our city as strong and vital as possible that's resonating with people? The messaging, I guess you could say.
Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. It is a conversation that's happening because it's so relevant and it links all of these other impacts that we're talking about. So one thing specific to Atlanta is Atlanta's in the South and think that it's pretty hot. Well, Atlanta's actually getting hotter for things related to urban heat island as an example. And so when we talk about the gardens and we talk about all of the energy efficiency improvements we're doing with the built environment, what happens if it continues to get hotter outside? Right? Those gardens are going to struggle. A lot of the energy efficiency improvements that we've made within our built environment, we're going to end up having to kick the air conditioners up more, and so where you thought you were going to see some savings. So we're absolutely looking at it. And so we've completed an urban tree canopy assessment for the city. We know exactly where the heat sinks are in the city. We're working collectively with the community right now to look at an urban heat management plan to attack those specific items. It's not just about planting trees, it's about planting trees, the right species, planting them in the right places. I mean, so it's all linked. So we absolutely are. Resiliency is key, and it's also linked to public health, community health, and vitality.
Oh, that's great.
So in San Francisco, this is definitely a hot topic. Not only is San Francisco an earthquake country, but we are on a peninsula, so we're surrounded by water on 3 sides. That makes San Francisco particularly vulnerable to climate change and particularly to sea level rise. So a couple really interesting initiatives in San Francisco. One is being led by our water department, the SFPUC. And what they did is actually through an adaptation initiative that was started last year, started a sea level rise subcommittee. And ultimately what they did is put together guidance that now is integrated as of this year into the capital planning process. It's a way that all city departments will be assessing their assets to see which ones will be vulnerable, particularly to sea level rise, and how to prioritize funding through the capital plan. So that's one exciting element.
That's really cool.
But also through the San Francisco Department of Public Health, who I'm working with right now, they got a grant from the CDC to look at vulnerable populations in San Francisco and how some of the impacts from climate change will be affecting health impacts, particularly in the city. So looking at both its city assets as well as our communities to make sure that they're more resilient. Definitely a hot topic, but we've just started that work.
That's great.
Yeah, and in Philly, very much a topic of conversation. We're lucky to be in a place where politically and otherwise we can very openly talk about it, which is helpful because it means that we can come together in a pretty robust planning effort, start looking at the climate science, matching it against our assets, and start putting a plan together. I think this is the area of emerging work in cities right now is how do cities do climate planning? Are we doing a bunch of one-offs? Are we going to create some kind of shared template that we all use as we proceed in this work so that we can talk to the federal government in a similar way, so that we can talk to private foundations, we can communicate out to the private sector? I think this is the area of emerging work that all of us are increasingly focusing our time on. But when we go out onto our conference trails, this is definitely the topic of conversation.
Okay, that's great. So I know, Laura, you have a question here at the mic, and I encourage anybody else.
We have one question over here as well.
Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't see over there. Thank you.
Just a theme running through. And Shelley, I think when you were getting at with Denise, hello, I'm from Atlanta originally, Laura Heary, Prozis. How did the Better Buildings Challenge get so much traction, and the districts played such an important role, the community improvement districts, in terms of organizing square footage? So the downtown self-taxing district got about 26 million square feet in, and then here came the Buckhead Improvement District. It added another 20 million square feet. And so that is an organizing structure, is a theme that I want to hear from you also, Shelley. Here I've enjoyed talking to David Kouris, who's in Connecticut, about the energy improvement districts in Connecticut. The governor doing 6 microgrid districts. In New York, there are aging improvement districts that LISC is part of. Health improvement districts is something we're interested in an initiative with the CDC. So where resilience seems to have this bias to be location focused, to pick a place and make it, or a high priority hospital, and make it resilient. So if you start to look at the district around it and the community benefits, are you finding an intersection that brings a little bit more stacking of capital where this district structure can start to have resilience emerge on a district scale, such as with
that's a good question. I know that, wow, there's a whole nother group that's cropping up called eco districts, which had their conference a couple weeks ago in Washington. And I do think that there is a lot of interest and receptivity, particularly from that notion of, you know, if the whole big power grid goes down, how can our neighborhood still be up and functioning? And an interesting kind of corollary to that is some work that we're doing in the Little Tokyo neighborhood in Los Angeles, where we're actually looking at whether or not an income stream could come off of a district, energy infrastructure, stormwater system, that could then create capital that would allow the community development group to continue to operate and have a function, a stable source of money. But I'm wondering, anybody here have any conversations going on in your communities about district level infrastructure or district responses? This is pretty new.
I'll just mention I was at the Eco Districts Conference, which was great. And in San Francisco, there's a new movement to do green benefit districts, where it would be a special tax assessment on particular neighborhoods that would then be invested in these types of initiatives. And there's a few eco districts in San Francisco as well. But the district scale and district level work is, it's very prevalent right now in cities. I don't know if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I would agree. So Atlanta has an overall large sustainability plan that was developed out of the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. But to the point that she made and talked about the community improvement districts, what's been so valuable about them is that while Atlanta is a nice sized city, everything isn't an issue in every single pocket of the city. And so, you know, what we're able to leverage, so when you talked about the CIDs, so there's Central Atlanta Progress that manages our downtown, there's a Midtown Alliance in our Midtown area, there's the Buckhead. And so within each of those respective community improvement districts, they have individuals who serve in a role very similar to myself. And so we actually, and you can look at my calendar, I have meetings with them on a weekly basis, a conference call where we have it locked up. And there's sometimes where the day before that call, I'll say, I don't have any issues to share. And they may say, neither do I. Or I do have something. And so it's been important because we're able to leverage. So certain places say green space is an issue in our respective particular district, while another may say we have a more aged infrastructure, and what can you do to help us, as opposed to we want to see more bike lanes and trails. So yes, we are able to leverage those particular areas.
That's really good. I'm going to go to, I think it's Neil that's at the mic over here.
Thank you. I'm Neil Pierce with the Cityscope. I have a question about cities and regions. When I think of Atlanta, I know it's a very small percentage of the Atlanta metropolitan region. San Francisco is famed, but also a huge Bay Area around it. Philadelphia has significant suburban territory. So to reach the goals that you're describing in cities is fantastic, and it's a very interesting development. But I'm wondering about the whole city-state, the whole metropolitan region. To what degree, if at all, have you been able to enlist the surrounding suburban communities to work on these types of issues with you? For instance, climate. You can have a wonderful climate record within the center city, but if the rest of the metropolitan region is not collaborating, you haven't made significant progress. So I'd be curious to know what policies or what outreach you've been able to make on this kind of metropolitan-wide.
And let's try and keep it short because we have one more question. I'd like to get it in before we close.
Yeah. And Philly regionalism, I think, might be a little unique. So we're a city and county unto ourselves, so we don't have a bigger governor structure that kind of forces us to come together with our surrounding suburban counties in the way that, like in Chicago is part of Cook County. So regionalism, I think, is kind of an unusual beast in Philadelphia. Certainly transit has been a connecting issue for us. We have a regional transportation authority that has been underinvested. Rallying point for us to come together and talk about what the future of mobility looks like, not only in the city, but connecting to the region. So I would say that's an example of a coming together point that also connects to our sustainability goals. But it's not necessarily for us a natural partnership all the time, just because the city is very different from the suburbs and we're not part of the same county structure.
And in San Francisco, or in the Bay Area, there are a lot of regional agencies that work on many different levels, whether it's transportation or land use planning. I will say on these topics, just recently the Rockefeller Foundation launched their Resilient 100 Cities initiative, And they actually funded a chief resilient officer in San Francisco, Berkeley, and Oakland with this idea that they want to spur that sort of regional collaboration around climate issues. So that's one structure that's been set up to spur on the regional work, but more needs to be done.
And just to add, with Atlanta, yes, we have about 453,000 or so as a population, but there's well over 1.5 million people in the city from 9 to 5 every day. But we also have what is called the Atlanta Regional Commission, and they do an awesome job of connecting the regional areas surrounding Atlanta, and there is an overall sustainability plan for the region.
Okay, let's take our last question over here.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Hill Knott, and I'm actually leading the development of the City of Detroit's Climate Action Plan.
Oh,
and so my question for you is really, in terms of legislative support in institutionalizing your process, is there a city council or are planning to have passed? And also, have you worked with state government to also support your efforts locally? My second question is, can you talk about some of your sources of funding for your respective offices?
Yeah, so in Philly, I mentioned before, we're coming up on the end of our current administration, so we'd been thinking a lot about this, and I think my strategy along the way was to build out support for sustainability and make sure that it was extending far beyond the mayor. And one of our core constituencies is our city council. I wanted them to feel ownership over it as well. So we've been trying to find ways to pass bills with as many members as we can so that they kind of have touch points. So our city council actually on their own initiative introduced and unanimously passed legislation to make our office permanent within city government. So it goes to the voters in just a couple of weeks as a ballot question. But it was an interesting and kind of unexpected move, and I thought kind of signaled a good vote of confidence that this is something that's been relevant to a broad swath of folks and that they support it and want to see it go forward. Now the other piece of that though is that you can't just kind of create these, yeah, it's permanent, check. You really still need to make sure that the community of supporters is activated. So even though we have this potential permanency in front of us, we're still kind of just making sure that everyone is, pushing in this next mayor's race and making sure that this is a top, and this is something we're seeing in the country, right? We've seen some leading mayors on this issue leave office in the last couple of years. Mayor Daley in Chicago, Mayor Bloomberg in New York, and it's not necessarily, climate is not necessarily an agenda item for the next mayor that comes on, and you start to lose a little bit of ground. So we're trying to figure out kind of within cities, but also within our bigger field, how do you create more accountability on mayors more generally, that this is something that they need to be working on. So I think it's still early days there, but we're starting to see some interesting test cases of kind of where it works, why, and where it doesn't work and why.
And it's great to hear you're doing that work here. That's awesome. I would say that in terms of legislation or policies that have been passed in relation to climate in San Francisco, the most compelling policy that was passed, which now a lot of cities have and have implemented, is progressive goals towards climate targets. So those are officially adopted by the City Council, leading all the way up to wanting to reduce carbon by 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, and having those officially codified targets are something to organize around. So I think that that's something definitely for the City Council and the government to look at. San Francisco just completed our updated climate action strategy that, looking at those goals, now has some very specific strategies in place about how to get there. So that's one recommendation. And in terms of funding, the Department of the Environment Office is a little unique. It doesn't receive any tax dollars. It receives no general fund dollars either. It's funded in 3 ways: grants from state, federal government, as well as foundations. Also through the garbage rates. So we actually have a small fee that's put onto the garbage bills of all San Franciscans. That's a very small fee that goes to fund the work around zero waste. And then also through energy efficiency programs through our utility. So that's the way that the department is funded in San Francisco.
And in Atlanta, the office has been around since 2008. I am the second person to serve in this position. It was originally funded through grant funds that actually ran out sometime, I think, in mid-2012.
Were those recovery funds?
They were recovery funds. I think it was, we had just over $6.5 million to fund the office and projects. So right now, the office, we have an office of 5, 2 of which are grant-funded positions, but it is a general funded office, we are able to continuously leverage grant funding. I'll be happy to share that with you. And we've been able to successfully prove and show our value. To garner additional funds. We put in big belly solars. We've helped to offset the additional cost to upgrade several of our fleet to compressed natural gas. I mean, so there's been ways that we've been able to show the value to bring it back. But yes, and we also have a climate action plan that we've developed for the city.
And we all have the bubble gum and duct tape.
Yes. Essential tools.
These guys are amazing because like you just get talking with them and you realize that their world is so complex. They're not just working on a single sector. They're really tackling it all. And I just want to thank you guys for showing us a little bit of this, and thank you, please.
Thanks, Shelley.